Good morning, folks. We'll just give it a minute while we admit folks into the room, etc. And then I'll introduce Beck and we'll kick things off. Pinch and a punch for the first day of the month and all that. Someone just reminded me it was April Fool's.
Is that why you scheduled my session today?
That's
That's rude,
exactly right.
Kalash. That's rude.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Go one more minute. Okay, I think we might make a start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Teaching Academy PD session. We're now well into the series for 2025-30, and we're lucky enough today to be joined by Beck Atchison from the Division of Learning and Teaching, who of course is a guru on all things assessment. So I've asked her today, begged really, for Beck to join us to talk about authentic assessment. And so she's put together a workshop around engaging with authentic assessment. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Beck and be relegated to the chat. Thanks, Beck.
Thanks, Lachlan. Hi, everyone. My name's Beck Atchison. As Lachlan said, I work in the Division of Learning and Teaching. My current role is project lead curriculum, but I have worked across educational design and various other areas within DLT. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say that I'm an assessment guru, but I do really like assessment. I like talking about it, and hopefully the people here also like talking about it. I did just want to say as well, more than happy for people to type questions into the chat. Also happy for people to come off mute, ask questions. I do like people to engage if they want to around this sort of stuff and ask things. If we have time, or if there's a particular thing that you're really interested in, please let me know, especially if it's not something that I touch on with a lot of depth. I'm happy to make sure that this is valuable for people. So I am just going to share my screen, and let's hope that I share the right one. Okay, brilliant. So just going to work out how I can see the most amount of stuff at a time. So first, I did want to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands from which we meet today. I personally am on Wiradjuri land in the shadow of the beautiful Walu, and I want to acknowledge collectively that we pay our respects to First Nation people who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country that we continue to learn from today, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Okay, so first things first, because I always like to make sure that we're primed and ready. Authentic assessment. So there's a lot of information out there about authentic assessment, what it is, what it isn't, what it's good for, what it has limitations on. There's a lot of information that you can absolutely go and engage with and read, and I highly recommend that you do. But some of the particular aspects of authentic assessment that struck me as being some of the more powerful parts of this were really from an article by Bald and Falkioff from 2006. So a little dated, but not as dated as some of the other literature that you'll find. Really, when we're talking about authentic assessment, we are talking about assessment that is in alignment with academic standards, that it supports students to develop their capacity to accurately judge their performance, and it prepares them for future learning and professional practice and life. And that is what's considered the authentic aspects of assessment when it is designed in this way. A really key part of this that BALD really focuses on is that positioning of students as assessors. So the idea that students are slowly over time enhancing their capacity to understand and validate and certify their own performance. And that's what really sets them up for that future learning in professional practice and life. So before we get too far, I did also just want to do a brief note about what authentic assessment is and what it is not. So authentic assessment is a valid form of assessment that can be designed to support student learning. Authentic assessment is not going to stop the use of generative AI by your students. So it's important to understand that authentic assessment, like anything, has its limitations. It has elements of it that are really valuable, but it also isn't going to be the answer to every assessment problem that you encounter. Authentic assessment is not always the most appropriate way to assess. We really do need to be thinking about what the learning outcomes are. Authentic assessment can be very challenging to do when you're teaching foundational subjects or when you're introducing new concepts. Also, just quickly, before we move into some of the other elements, it's important to touch on some of the misconceptions around authentic assessment. So sometimes people want to deal with authenticity as really binary, whether something is either authentic or non-authentic, but it actually is a continuum. And there's an appropriateness to the authenticity that needs to be determined. You could argue that all assessment has a level of artifice, that it's not a real situation, that it is contrived, and that there are elements of that that are somewhat inescapable, particularly when you're looking at certification, qualifications, etc. So some of the other kind of myths too is that people sometimes think that they have to be some sort of master of authentic assessment before they can use it. But most of you are probably already using authentic assessment or elements of authentic assessment within the subjects and courses that you're teaching. So it is about how to look for the opportunity to enhance authentic assessment where possible. The other kind of element too that is interesting is that authentic tasks can sometimes be seen to be really complex and elaborate, and sometimes the opportunities for authentic assessment can be really small but powerful. So just a few things to kind of think about when we're talking about what authentic assessment is and what authentic assessment is not. But if you're here for a silver bullet for generative AI, unfortunately, I don't have that. But what we do have is a range of things that we can look at that can help with some of those challenges that you might be facing. So would it even be a PD session if there wasn't a Mentimeter? That is one of my new philosophies. So I do have a Menti here that I wanted to get people to engage with. So I have the link, which I can copy into the chat. Give me one moment. It's not going to let me. I also have the QR code as well there for people if they need it. Is there, Kalish, do you know if there's an easy way for me to get that link in my current situation?
Does anyone else have the deck or hop out of presentation mode to highlight it?
Cool.
Or everyone gets their phone out?
Ah, yes, very good. One moment. Let me see if I can find the easier way. Okay.
Just put it in for you, Beck.
Ah, thank you.
Or someone types it. Thanks,
yeah.
Veronica.
Thanks, Veronica. Okay, so first things I wanted to kind of talk about really is what is authentic assessment? I want to kind of hear from you what you feel it is. So here are some of the results. So we've got relevant to practice. Absolutely. It assesses what it's designed to assess. Absolutely. I would argue that that second one is not only right, but that is what assessment should do, whether it's authentic or inauthentic. It's a very key part. Relevance to the discipline, very important. Clearly aligned to subject learning outcomes. I'm loving that. Absolutely. Very much based on related to practice, that it's structured to showcase knowledge. Absolutely. Fair, valid, and reliable. Always a good start. Practice. Content and learning outcomes, applying knowledge to skills, meaningful, prepares students. Students relate their study and relate it to practice. Absolutely. So there's some really key parts to this. So some of the themes coming out obviously are that very much that world of work, those professional skills, that practice, that idea of future practice, I think is really nice around authentic assessment, because what we're doing is trying to set students up to have those skills to be able to engage in the future and to draw on them when they encounter complexity, when they encounter problems, when they encounter ambiguity, which is something that happens more and more for students in the world of work. Anyone else have anything that they wanted to add in, or anything they wanted to come off mute and say around what is authentic assessment? I think as well, some of the things that authentic assessment is it's about ensuring also that students have all of the skills that they need to be able to engage successfully in some of those spaces that we're talking about. So within their community, within their profession, and being able to kind of have that real life kind of messiness where there's not necessarily a really clear cut answer, and having students feel confident and comfortable to engage with some of that. Okay, thank you. I will jump to my next slide. So, according to some very smart people, some of the benefits of authentic assessment are that it can support and enhance the quality and depth of student learning. And that ties into the second one, which is about the development of higher order skills. So if you come from an education background, you've probably been spoken into the ground about HOTS and LOTS, higher order thinking, lower order thinking. Those elements are around how do we get students into spaces where they really can think critically, engage in problem solving, be analytical, have those really complicated skills, being able to understand how things fit together, how to break them apart, how to engage. Authentic assessment can also really support self-directed learning and student autonomy. So part of what we touched on that Boud and Falkioff were talking about is student as assessor. So helping students to be able to understand what is expected of them so that they can more adequately understand their performance, and also to build their capacity to be able to engage in enhanced performance. So it can improve motivation and commitment to learning. So students often say things like, I don't understand how this fits with being a pharmacist or being a teacher. So sometimes authentic assessment can really help them connect those dots. It is difficult when you're sort of in that sort of pre-practitioner space where you're working towards gaining that qualification and moving into that professional identity, to sometimes be able to see the importance of the theory that you're learning to that practice and to the things that you're going to be doing. So authentic assessment and the way that we engage in teaching can really help students, which can be really reinforcing for their motivation for continuing their studies. It can also support metacognition and reflection. A big part of authentic assessment is about getting students to reflect on their learning processes, to understand themselves, to understand others, to reflect on their experiences and look at how they can draw on that to support them with that future learning. So it can achieve some really great things when students engage with well-designed authentic assessment. So for my next mentee, I did want to hear from you around what are the features of authentic assessment. So when you look at an assessment, how do you determine if that assessment is authentic? What are some of the things you look for? What are some of the features that you might engage with? Yep, so we've got quite a bit there on scenarios, meta language, clear purpose, practical, links to real examples, skills plus content, yep. Yep. So when you think about the features of authentic assessment, what do you kind of think about students? Not traditional text type, yeah, that can absolutely be a very key part of authentic assessment. Yeah, so Jenna, I saw in the chat, meeting diverse learning needs, lack of academic jargon. I do love a little bit of jargon busting, yes. I think we're all a little guilty of falling into our own discourses sometimes. Hands-on, yes, I think that's a really good one. So I think what we're sort of seeing and kind of landing on, and feel free to come off mute if anyone wants to say anything or type things in the chat or into the word cloud. I do think that there are a lot of features of authentic assessment. And that's one of those things that I sort of wanted to touch on is that, as I sort of said, one of those myths is that something is either inauthentic or it's authentic, but it's actually really more of a scale for assessment. So thinking through some of those things. So I can see in the chat as well, lots of things about it being pragmatic and that jargon, yeah, and that's a really good point about jargon in practice is that what we are trying to do with students sometimes is induct them into the use of discipline specific discourse. And that can sometimes involve jargon or that can involve very specific words. And so it's important to acknowledge that we are helping them to learn that and to be able to use that language and to understand what it encompasses. Marissa.
Sorry, I just wanted to sort of give a bit of an example for that. I just find a lot of students don't always connect the dots between why you were saying before about the content. So why am I doing chemistry if I'm going to be a dietitian? Well, we know why, but also why are you getting me to critique an article? Like we know why we want them to be able to understand evidence, but they don't always get it. So it's just making that bridge for them. Yeah.
Absolutely, Marissa. That's such a brilliant point, and you've inadvertently activated one of my favorite things to talk about, which is how little we use the rationale section in the subject outline to actually explain why this assessment task is worth their time, what it's going to do, how it fits with things. And obviously, there's lots of other spaces if you're doing that too. Like you mentioned, like that's really part of the teaching and learning practices. We should be doing that in our content. But yeah, if a student doesn't understand while they're studying chemistry, they're already behind the 8 ball to actually learn what we need them to learn, because they can't associate it into that bigger schema they have for practice. And so that really is such a key part. So I know that was a really good point. And yes, if anyone ever wants to talk about how the rationale section of the subject outline is underutilized, I have time and thoughts. But no, absolutely. And that is part of that inducting students as well. Yeah, Kailash, there is a rationale section. Usually it's just got the learning outcomes in it because they're required to be ticked. Okay, brilliant. Well, we've got some great information in here about what are the features of authentic assessment. Let's have a little look at what some of the smarty pants people who research this say. Some of the things they say, there was a really good article by a bunch of academics. Villarreal is the first, but Bloxham is also involved if anyone's a fan. They did a bit of a meta-analysis of some of the articles that are out there around authentic assessment, and they categorized in 3 areas the features of authentic assessment that come up in the literature the most. So the 3 main areas were realism, cognitive challenge, and evaluative judgment. So they then went further down into the attributes of authentic assessment that sit below those, and they come up with things like problems contextualized to everyday life, relevance beyond the classroom, authentic performance, competencies for work performance, similar tasks to the real/working world, and practical value, which I think resonates a lot with what we saw in the Menti and what you were feeling are the features of authentic assessment. So the other one was cognitive challenge, and there's that higher order thought, that ability to solve problems, that ability to make decisions. So that's really some of what the literature is saying is a feature of authentic assessment is sort of moving students into spaces where they're having to undertake to solve a problem or to make a decision, which ultimately aligns with a lot of that stuff in that realism space around authentic performance, competencies for work. Evaluative judgment, I think, is one of the interesting kind of space, and I probably refer back to it a bit, but I think for Bowden and Falkioff, that is that building student capacity for them to understand and evaluate their own performance. And I think that elements around that, around feedback, formative sense, and assessment criteria known upfront, those are some really powerful pieces within the literature. So with evaluative judgment, I think this is the part where it can feel the most challenging, really, around authentic assessment to achieve. I think a lot of people are quite comfortable in sort of trying to have case studies or real world scenarios, or to move students into problem solving spaces or decision making spaces. But sometimes the evaluative judgment piece can be quite challenging. There's some literature out there pretty much by David Bowd and a bunch of people from Cradle and other areas that talk about the idea of assessment being building a student's ability to self-assess to the point where you're just validating their own assessment. And ultimately, I think that can be a really challenging thing to initially kind of think about or understand how to do. But ultimately, that is something that we want to build our students towards. There's going to be a point in time where they've graduated, they're in practice, and we want them to be able to understand their performance, to be able to assess their lifelong learning needs, and to be able to validate that for themselves. And so there is a bit of a thought that assessment actually should, over time, build towards us validating student self-assessment rather than being the validator of the performance. So an interesting thing to think about, probably quite challenging to implement, but doesn't mean it's not worth thinking about. So that realism element comes from real life. It's about realistic situations. It's also about that information or those skills and knowledge being transferable into workplace contexts by students so that they can do this learning over here, but then they can also draw upon it and use it again in a different context. That cognitive challenge piece goes beyond just reproducing knowledge in sort of low order content and more towards that complex aspect of mastery, of really knowing how things connect together and being able to use that to engage in challenging problems. And that evaluative judgment really is, as I was sort of talking about students understanding what is good performance and also being able to engage in that lifelong capability to regulate their learning and performance in ways that they need to. So, authenticity of assessment. So I wanted to have a little bit of a think about evaluating, how we might go about it. Now, there is a particular approach to this that I quite like, and it is sort of the attributes of authentic assessment. So Mueller kind of came up with this idea that there are some features of traditional assessment and some features of authentic assessment. And for him, they kind of form a continuum. So for him, traditional assessment, and when he says traditional assessment, he really is most likely talking about exams. He's talking about some very traditional types of assessment. So he's talking about selecting a response as being quite an inauthentic and very traditional approach to assessment, that those types of assessment are usually very contrived. It's usually focusing around recall or recognition. They're very teacher structured and very indirect evidence. So as a counter to some of that, he is saying that authentic assessment is about performing a task. It's real life. It's construction application focused. It's student structured, and there's direct evidence. So for me, I think this scale can be really useful when you're thinking about an assessment task. When you're thinking about how authentic is this assessment task, remembering that there is no way to say that something is fully authentic. We're looking at how can we look at the pieces and enhance elements of the authenticity to move it towards being more authentic. And also understanding that traditional assessment is not necessarily a problem to be solved. Sometimes traditional assessment or having students being closer to some of the ends of the traditional assessment kind of continuum can be very necessary based on the subject learning outcomes, based on what the students are learning about and where they are in their journey. So I'll just unpack a little bit some of the sections because we are going to use this model to look at some assessment. So selecting a response, really that is talking about select A, B, C, or D, which of these match, true, false. There is a right answer when you are dealing with that. In contrast with authentic assessments, when we're asking students to demonstrate their understanding by performing a task or by creating something, a product, an artifact of their learning that is significantly different to selecting a response. Contrived to real life, contrived is often very much in a particular space. It's a way to structure assessment to fit with the environment that you're in. Real life and authentic assessments are about that proficiency by doing. It's about engaging in that space. It's about contextualizing the actions, the performance, the production of learning. So the recall to construction application, often a lot of assessment can be about representing knowledge or content rather than applying those things or constructing artifacts of learning. So students in more authentic assessment are usually being asked to analyze, synthesize, apply, and create new meaning as they do that. Teacher structured to student structured. Teacher structured are usually very set assessments. They've been carefully structured. Authentic assessment often allows for choice. It allows students to have a bit more agency in either what they are learning about or demonstrating their knowledge, or how they go about that. So there's a couple of levers in there that they can choose. Student structured tasks have strengths and weaknesses that have to be considered when you're choosing and designing an assessment. Teacher structured tasks can as well. And again, just to stress that a teacher structured task is not bad. A student structured task is not good. It is about what serves the learning and what you're trying to facilitate for your students. Indirect evidence versus direct evidence. So that indirect evidence is sort of, again, if you think multiple choice quiz, where the student is picking the right answer and we then have to infer that they could then apply that. Direct evidence is actually seeing the student engage in or present a product that demonstrates that process. So a student can show you the evidence of them being able to meet that learning requirement in a much more direct way in particular authentic tasks. So are there any questions or anything anyone wanted to ask about this? Now, I'm not going to say that this is the best or most comprehensive thing. I think that there's a lot out there that you could draw upon as models. But from my perspective, the strength of this is about being able to plot an assessment that you want to evaluate for its authenticity, and to actually see where you might be able to enhance elements of it, or where you may potentially be able to spot the opportunity to be more authentic in the design of the assessment. So I appreciate that's quite quick, but what I wanted to jump into is actually having a look at an assessment. So I'll get you to jump into the Menti, which I will move to the right page. And then I'm just going to jump to another slide very quickly that has the assessment I want us to look at. So once you're in the Menti, and I think the link's in the chat, I will jump to the next slide so we can have a look. So what I want us to do is, in the Mentimeter, I've created the slider from what you've just seen based on Mueller's work on the continuum. So I've got a snip here of an assessment task. And what I want you to do is I want you to actually rank where this assessment falls on the continuum for those different authentic assessment attributes. So this is a psychology assessment from a real CSU subject. It is a 45-minute, 15% Brightspace quiz. There's 30 multiple choice questions on topic 1 to 3. So you can see that this is assessment 1. They can complete it over a window of time. The exam is open book. Those are the topics that it covers, and there's a bit of information there about the grading. So I'll leave that on the screen for a little bit and then I'll jump into the Menti. But what I want you to kind of think about is based on those continuums, where would this assessment fall? So I'm just going to pop open the Menti and make sure we're on the right one. Brilliant. Okay. So I wasn't able to have the labels down the bottom, but you've done very well. So if you want to jump in and consider that, or if you want to type things in the chat, or if you want to come off mute and talk to me about it, I'll let you have a little bit of time and I'll just quickly pop back up for you to be looking at the actual assessment task here. I'll just give you 30 more seconds to have a little bit of a think, and then we'll jump into having a little bit of a chat about the results. Okay, so I'll pop the results back up. Okay, so what we've got here is that where are we on the selecting to performing scale? I think we can be pretty confident that we are very much in the selecting space. Contrived to real life, I think, without more information, it probably is very likely that we're on the contrived end of the spectrum. The recall to application, I think, is a reasonable one. I think it probably is around about that space because some of the questions might have application elements to them, but it's more of a theoretical application, if that makes sense, rather than the students actively applying things. And teacher to student structured, I think we are very much on the teacher end of this spectrum. And indirect to direct evidence, I think we are pretty comfortably there. So I think the results really reflect what you're sort of seeing in the assessment. One thing I did want to ask, and you can feel free to answer in the chat or you can come off mute, is this a problem? What does this tell us about this assessment task? Depends what other task sits alongside. That's right, Kalash, yes. Very good. It's foundational. Not if the other, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what I wanted to put in here, and I picked on psychology, the reason I wanted to do this, first of all, is to say that it doesn't, just because something isn't ticking all the authentic ends of the spectrum, doesn't mean it's not a good assessment. Doesn't mean that it's not forming a purpose for the students. It doesn't mean that it isn't a valuable way to engage in assessment. So being aware, obviously, and I kind of called it out a little bit, that was assessment task 1. We don't know where this subject falls in the degree. The students could still be quite foundational. Low stakes quiz, this could actually be more about just making sure the students are awake and there, giving them a little bit of motivation, making sure that they're keeping up with the learning. It covered topic 1 to 3. And so thinking about this kind of task. Also, we touched on a little bit as well that authentic assessment can be really challenging for students. And so it's not always appropriate. That being said, thinking about how you could make a task more authentic and still meet some of these needs of students for it to be formative or it's foundational can still be an interesting undertaking if you are looking at how you might want to make this particular task more authentic, should that be something that you've decided is necessary given the learning needs of the students. So I will jump back quickly to another assessment task. And so with this one, we're going to do the same thing again with the Menti, which the link is still in the chat. This one is an assessment task from a very different discipline. Jumped over to FOSH. This one's an assessment one. It's worth 30%. It's about collecting 15 to 30 different orders. So there is a bit of jargon in this one, but I assume they've explained that. Collecting some arthropods, looking at different things. It's got some instructions in there. It's got some important points about collecting your specimens. Yes, sorry, Louise, can do. There we go. So that's the Menti again in the chat. So again, based on our little continuum that we've got, looking for you to have a bit of a go at thinking about what this assessment task, where it fits, what's it doing. And I'll chuck the results up in a little bit, but I'll leave this on the screen so that you can be considering it. And for my arts and eds academics present, there will be an arts and ed one, don't worry. I have tried to pick one from each faculty. Okay, I might just check in on the results. And so we are obviously at a very different end of the spectrum on this one. Everyone seems to kind of be agreeing on that one. So I'll give you 30 more seconds just to have a little bit of a think. I'll pop the slide back up. Let you have a little bit of a look at that. Is that you telling me I have to make an articulate, Kailash?
I think just embed your Menti somewhere, maybe. but sure.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump back to the results. And I think we're about here. Very good. Okay, so selecting to performing, I think we are very comfortably on the performing end of the spectrum with this one. They're obviously having to undertake a task, create that collection, contrive to real life. I think this is probably pretty real life if you're someone who is involved in animal conservation or wanting to move into that as a profession or a space. Recall to application, I think this is very much on that application end of the spectrum. Teacher to student structured, I think this one, I probably might not have put it that high. I still think it's quite a structured task, but I think the students do have some choice in there, right? They have some opportunity to decide which specimens they'll collect and how to kind of go about that. So there is a bit of a student structured element in there, but it is still quite a set assessment, which can be great. Indirect to direct evidence, I think this is very much moving towards that direct evidence. if this was an indirect, this could have been asking them about what is the best approach to collecting arthropods, how would you display a specimen. That's me giving you indirect evidence of my understanding of that. Them actually doing this process, collecting these specimens, displaying them, etc., that is moving more to that direct evidence. So I'm going to ask my question again. Does that mean that this is a good assessment? I'll pop the slide back up. I like it too, Alicia. I think it's a cool assessment. I think this sounds like a cool subject. But does this mean this is a good assessment? Ruth says yes. Anyone else want to register their thoughts? Louise said she'd be interested if she was a student. The value of the task is more useful than good. Yeah. I think it's structured but still flexible. Yep, good points. I would say I'm probably with Di a little bit on this one. And Catherine, it depends on, and you'll notice because of my inability to snip the subject outline tool very well, it depends on, for me, if this task is aligned with those learning outcomes and what students do with this next, if that makes sense. So it is a really authentic task, but sometimes you can have an authentic task that isn't doing what it needs to do. And so there is an element still to come back. I want to be really clear that I think this task probably is good, but I do think that it's really important to ensure that we aren't just making something really authentic that actually isn't what we want students to learn or is not connected into that bigger purpose of the course and subject. So AI proof. This one, I don't know, Kalash. I may have inadvertently found one of the very few AI proof assessments that we've got, because I don't think you can fake finding an arthropod. That's it. We can go home. Exactly. We've solved it. Everyone just makes their students collect arthropods from now on, and we're going. I don't know how comfortable I'll be going to a hospital if all of the assessments are just people finding arthropods, but who can say? So yeah, so I think you probably are pretty safe to say, yes, this is a good assessment, but that's not just hinging on if it is authentic. But I think we can safely say that that was an authentic task. So the meta learning of this is that scale can be really useful to take your assessment task and think about those dimensions. And then think about if where you're putting your task, what you're thinking about on those different dimensions, if that's where you want it to be, if you think it's where it needs to be for the students, and if there are areas where you might want to consider doing things a little bit differently. It is also really useful as well, and I probably should talk about that too, when you're designing, greenfield, brand new task, good to have that scale front and center for yourself and thinking about where you want things to be. So obviously we're evaluating existing assessments, but it can be used for new ones. So that's kind of the purpose of that. The next kind of piece is looking at redesigning. So we've just evaluated assessments. One of the things I wanted to have a little bit of a look at, and I don't have a Menti for this one, is a sociology assessment. So here you see I also snipped in the subject learning outcomes because we will need those. So this is assessment item 2. It's an essay. It's worth 50%, 1,500 words. You can see it's a little bit old because it says EAST is the submission method. So that's a little blast from the past for everyone. This one is about answer one of the following questions. So we've got heart disease has become a significant area. How does sociology of mental health challenge the health and healthcare system? You've got some other ones there about health policy, your choices, choose one of the following health contexts for a marginalised group. You've got the news is full of health messages and warnings, write an analysis of principles and concepts found in sociology of health promotion. Fourth one, again, very much around picking a group and use sociology of action and change to explore how the group can mobilise to change their health actions. So Kailash has very kindly put the scales in there. What I wanted to do is initially kind of get people's feeling for where this assessment falls on those scales. I probably should have made it a Menti, to be honest. Probably would have been easier. But I want you to kind of think about that aspect, and also though thinking about if we were going to be considering changing this to be more authentic, what might we change? So I'm just quickly making a Menti for this, to be honest. So I will hopefully, there we go. So if you want to jump into the Menti and actually do the ratings for this one, I'll leave it on the scale, on the assessment. So, but you should be able to jump in to the Menti and have a bit of a go at rating it. Then I want to have a quick look in the 8 minutes I have left at another assessment task design framework that we can use that might help us isolate in on some particular aspects of things we might want to look at. Okay, so I'll just pop up the results to make sure everyone's okay in here. All right, so our sociology one. So I did promise we'd get an arts and ed example, so this is it. Okay, so we're kind of in the middle on this one. And I think that is fair. I think Catherine's put a really good point in saying that the majority of students take sociology subjects are taking them as elective. And I think this one in particular, because I probably picked on the sociology of health, which is very much sociology for people who are studying other disciplines too. So that's a very good comment from Catherine around this. So always having to think about what are some of the pragmatics too that we have to think about when it comes to authentic assessment. So I'll pop the slide back up just so that you can have a little bit of a look here. But I think we're sort of landing on, it's kind of in the middle for some stuff. There is some choice, you know, they've got 4 set questions, so the students can choose something that's maybe more aligned with their interests or their field or their future practice. We do also have some of the learning outcomes around being able to apply sociological concepts and theories, being able to demonstrate the significance of the sociological approach to making sense of health and medical issues, and written presentation of an argument. So there is an element too that part of this assessment is about their ability to write and be persuasive. So there's elements of that too. So I'll pop this one open. So I think selecting to performing, we are in the middle on that one, I think. Arguably though, is that something we could change? Not too sure. Contrive to real life, I think we are a little bit more on probably the contrived end of the spectrum, but again, that's not necessarily an issue. On the recall to application, I think we are kind of in the middle. I think there's definitely some theories that are being applied. It's not actually going out and surveying people or doing those kinds of things around this stuff. But again, those kinds of assessments can be really challenging. I think teacher to student structured, I think where we're sitting is probably about right. Again, it is quite a teacher structured task, but there is some student choice, an element in there, which I think can be really, can be a really good way to kind of navigate that. Like again, being more teacher structured is not necessarily a problem. Indirect to direct evidence, I think we are kind of in the middle on that one. So let's pretend that we teach this subject and we've done this initial evaluation of our assessment. We've never had any real major student critique of the assessment. They're all usually fairly happy with the assessment, but we're interested in seeing what might be possible, what we might want to consider doing if we did want to make this more authentic, how we could kind of move into that space. One of the ways to kind of do that is to consider using the assessment design framework. So the ATD framework. This was a framework developed by Claire Hughes. The link on the slide I'll make available. This is a document that you can download that lets you break your task into its parts and consider where you might want to build certain aspects or not. This isn't necessarily about authenticity, but I think combining the scale with this particular analysis of task can be really powerful. It can allow you to really see some things. So you can see that there's these different boxes. So task purpose, and if you scroll down, we've got some good definitions here as well. We've got some task purposes really about the learning outcomes the students are demonstrating and how that fits back to the bigger course learning outcomes and graduate attributes. So that's what you would pop into that box as well, as what are the learning outcomes that you're wanting to assess. With the type of text that you might see here, this is where you're really thinking about what you are asking students to do. So your type of text is what are the types of text, and you'll have to think a little more broadly about the word text here. So this was written in a sense about written artifacts, but it could be performance, it could be artifact, it could be lots of things, but what product will allow students to demonstrate their learning most effectively? And has the right text been chosen? Is there another text that might better demonstrate or enhance their learning? So we can pop in here that, you know, it's a very structured essay and pop these things in here. Subject matter really does come down to what will be the context of the text. This is the core topic of the task. So what are they really getting at? So in this, there's obviously quite a bit of information about it being around those sociological concepts when they're being applied to the making sense of health and medical issues. So we could definitely fill that bit out in here around that being the real core of what's in this task. For mode or medium, again, it can be about, is it written, is it spoken, is it visual? If it's, you know, face-to-face, is it paper-based, electronic? Should this be used? How can we look at what we're actually asking students to do and the mode and medium which we're asking them to do it in? But the part that I often find really, really useful in this particular framework personally is what's the student's role? What's their relationship to the text audience? And what's the student's relationship to the subject matter? And for me, this is a box where this can be a really good way to unlock a bigger understanding of authenticity for your assessment task, because we often are quite silent on what the student's role is. and we often have an implied audience of the academic or marker. And that can be a source of inauthenticity, which again is not necessarily an issue, but it can also be a way to consider. So as we're running out of time, and it is on the hour, and I appreciate people have to run away, I will just quickly touch on the fact that one of the things that could be considered with this particular task, if we were wanting to heighten some of the authenticity, is about potentially looking at that type of text that they're creating, and potentially the roles and relationships that students are inhabiting within that assessment task. There's nothing to stop us from considering asking students to create different text types that might communicate to a different audience, and that might heighten the authenticity because maybe educating people about particular health and medical issues in particular sociological contexts might be really valuable. That being said, that is what we would do if we wanted to make this more authentic. Perhaps there are subsequent assessment tasks that will do that. Is that something we want to do? Again, it comes back to those learning outcomes. Really authentic tasks don't automatically become perfectly amazing assessments doing exactly what we need them to do. So that framework that we looked at, as well as the slider, can really help you look at how to move the dial a little bit on aspects of the task to try and enhance that authenticity for your students. And just to quickly sum up, really authentic assessment, it can be a valuable approach to design of assessments. It can be really engaging for students. It can be really interesting to look at the features and attributes of authentic assessment and look at how you might want to enhance that within some of your existing tasks or when you're designing from scratch, which is always a luxury. But authentic assessment is just one approach to assessment, and it needs to be considered in the context of the course and the subject and the student's learning. And it also needs to be understood that one assessment task being authentic doesn't necessarily move the needle much. We need to be thinking about the course. We need to be thinking about some of that problem element, some of those higher order skills that we want to build with students, and that it's okay to have inauthentic tasks if they serve that learning purpose. But obviously moving into authentic assessment spaces can be really, really powerful for your students. And it can also be much more interesting for you as academics and markers to engage with and to represent the complexity of the profession and discipline in which you are inducting students. On that note, I will show my final slide, which is if there's any questions. I appreciate I've gone a little bit over time, so more than happy to take any questions if people have them, but also more than happy for people to say thank you so much and then jump to your next meeting. Marissa.
I have disappeared. There you go, that's better. Just wondering, sorry, I had to step away for a sec. With that document you had, did you share a link for that? Was that in the chat somewhere, or was
It's
that
on the PowerPoint, but we can absolutely chuck it in the chat for you as well. And
No
I've
worries,
got,
thank
I'll
you.
pop a link as well into one of the journal articles by the academic who has done that work as well that touches on it
Okay,
a
cool.
little bit.
Awesome. Thanks, Beck. This has been really, really good.
All right, thanks, Marissa. Okay, well, if there's any other questions that anyone has, more than happy to take them. But otherwise, I will wrap up there. Thank you for coming along. I do really appreciate it. And I hope that that was valuable. Always happy to talk about assessment. Always happy to talk about what we might want to consider doing and why we might want to consider doing it. And also, just as a small plug, feel free to write some stuff in that rationale section of your subject outline. That would be neat. I love that section, and I very, very infrequently find information in there that people have written, and I think that that could be a really good way to start to engage your students in that assessment purpose, inducting them into why they're doing what they're doing and how that can support them. So I'll stop sharing And thank you all for coming along today.